Mexico has 130 million inhabitants. It is the most populous Spanish-speaking country and has the world's 15th largest economy by nominal GDP. Mexican democracy is one of the newest in the Americas, considering that shortly after the revolution in 1917, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, governed for 71 uninterrupted years, from 1929 until 2000. It initiated a slow transition in which some institutions, particularly the electoral bodies, won independence from political power. However, at the same time, criminal groups such as the well-known Cartel de Sinaloa were gaining a presence in the territory, and the population was increasingly detached from a system that appeared distant, unresponsive, and corrupted. The 2018 elections were a turning point for the country, as Andrés Manuel López Obrador and his new party, Morena, won the presidency. However, López Obrador was not an outsider, as he had previously been a member of the PRI and the PRD. Obrador became a controversial leader that attacks his political adversaries, increasing polarization. The president keeps a high level of popular support, but the Constitution does not allow him to run for re-election. On June 2, 2024, Mexicans will decide among 3 candidates. The 2 more prominent are, for the first time in history, women. Claudia Sheinbaum from Morena served as head of government of Mexico City, and Xochitl Gálvez, also with previous political experience at PAN and now the candidate of the Broad Front, composed by the main parties in the opposition. In this episode of Who is Voting in 2024, we want to know what's going on in the country and to what extent the violence is challenging democracy in general and this electoral process in particular. Today, we will speak with Sandra Ley, political scientist, head of the security program at México Evalúa, and Javier Aparicio, economist and professor at the CIDE. Welcome, Sandra. Javier.
So let us start with a more general question. Mexico initiated a slow transition in the 2000s, strengthening institutions, but without delivering enough improvements in living conditions, while at the same time criminality was expanding. Javier, could you retrace the step that led us here?
Sure. Thank you for the invitation. I think the first 20 years of the Mexican transition can be regarded as a success story, in the sense that after several decades of having a hegemonic party system, civil society started pushing to vote for the opposition, and there was a sort of virtuous cycle of more increasing votes from the opposition, electoral reforms, more credible organization of elections, and little by little, we reached a competitive party system with contested elections and credible elections, if not perfect. This happened between 1997 and the year 2000. After that, we had 18 years of divided governments. And for many analysts, those 18 years of divided governments seemed like a success. Like, look, you have presidents, executives negotiating with fragmented congresses, and there's an evolution of checks and balances and whatnot. And the novelty after 2018 was that for the first time, we had a president with democratic legitimacy and unified government, majority in both chambers. And as we have discovered in the last 5 to 6 years, this was a new challenge for the young democracy. I think Mexico is a young democracy. We are facing the challenges of, we find out that the president and the executive is still very powerful in Mexico, despite having credible elections and a diversified party system.
Now let me turn to Sandra, because Sandra, you have a very interesting research on the levels of violence in the country. I would like to know more about your research and your outcomes, please.
Thank you, Janine, again for the invitation and for the opportunity to share the research that you refer. So we have to understand that the organized crime-related violence that we see today in Mexico is deeply related to the process of transition to democracy in the Mexican case. So the work that I've developed with Guillermo Trejo in the book Votes, Drugs, and Violence, we find that organized crime needs some form of state protection, and that state protection has its origins in authoritarianism. And that's precisely what we find in the Mexican case. It was during that authoritarian period that organized crime in Mexico has its origins, with the state judicial police as the most important repressive arm of the Mexican government, but at the same time as a specialist in violence that through which the authoritarian regime was able to survive and help organized crime develop. So the fact that the Mexican transition to democracy had its emphasis on the electoral side meant that we had indeed more competition, but that we didn't dismantle those networks of protection that had been built during the authoritarian period, and that in the post-authoritarian period in Mexico, in the transition to democracy in Mexico, indeed we had more competition, but we also had more space for organized crime to act, right, and to expand its roots. So Mexico experienced a transition from uncompetitive to competitive elections without developing a democratic rule of law. And this meant that when new parties came into gubernatorial power in particular, then new informal networks of protection were vulnerable, but organized crime was trying to make sure that such protection was available in some way, building its own private armies, but at the same time pushing for new electoral authorities to expand those networks of protection. And so all through the 1990s, and then back in the 2000s, when we had a new party coming in, what this meant was simply the multiplication of organized crime. We have an illiberal democracy that has been unable to build a strong rule of law. Organized crime then has been able to establish subnational criminal governance regimes, given this weakness of the Mexican democracy. And what we see overall is not only the rise in homicide rate over this period, we also see the transformation of violence and its expansion with more disappearances, with organized crime being able to have a direct influence in local politics. So we have moved from just a dozen politicians being attacked by organized crime in the mid-1990s up to 800 in the 2018 to 2023 period. This means that in hundreds of municipalities, it's organized crime who has become a de facto ruler. And so this changes the way in which we can even talk about democracy, Janina. The quality of democracy is in question in Mexico. Perhaps we are not even being able to talk about illiberal democracy in some of these municipalities. It's more about narco rule in some places. Even though institutions are still working, we still have elections. So there are democratic features that are still present, but it's hard, right, to make a sense of where democracy stands in some of the Mexican municipalities.
Yeah, the picture you are offering is really worrying and impressive. I have so many questions now, but just to follow on this axis, you said somehow it's difficult to talk about democracy, and then we have now a context of an election which seems quite important in institutional terms, while on the other side you are talking about criminal governance, a path that is coming before Andrés Manuel López Obrador during the transition. How these two axes confluent in the current process. Javier, do you feel that democracy will survive after this process? Is challenges at which levels?
I believe that Mexican democracy is currently facing its most challenge in 15 years. Maybe after the 2006 election, the 2006 election was very, very contested, less than 1 percentage point in margin of victory. But that was an electoral crisis, so to speak. But I think what Sandra points out is one of another good example of what the Mexican transition is lacking, is that we move towards competitive and credible elections, but the quality of government has not improved a lot. Like, for instance, yes, we saw increases in social spending, some enhancements in social policy. We saw that with democratization. But if we focus on corruption, impunity, the rule of law, and or tackling criminal governance, democratic transition in Mexico doesn't have a lot to show for itself. And now the current government, the current president, he won after 3 attempts, and he made a promise to finish with corruption and try to pacify the country. He couldn't do it. And not only he couldn't do it, the problems of criminal governance and violence and homicides are actually worse. Are worse in numbers, but also worse in that now we have a new actor, which is the military. The military forces are being used to do police work, and that's also a danger. So you have a president that tries to concentrate power, right? Attacking the judiciary, attacking autonomous bodies, the electoral body, the electoral tribunal, and so on, but also not being able to solve the most basic issues, to live in peace, or to try to control illegal activities. So I think we have, I wouldn't say not a twofold challenge, but it's a threefold challenge. Is whether or not competitive elections will survive, whether or not are we witnessing the emergence of a new hegemonic party or not, and the point that Sandra makes, like are we going to coexist with elections amidst the threat of violence?
Yeah, this is a good point, but at the same time, it's something quite particular in Mexico. If we look at Latin America in general, presidents are not so popular, and Andrés Manuel López Obrador keeps his popularity. How do you explain that, Sandra?
I think that something very interesting about the administration by Andrés Manuel López Obrador is the narrative that he has been able to build. And he's able to build it every single day. So every single day you see the president, right, for 2 hours at least, talking and building a narrative. There's a narrative that he has been able to work around. So that's the first element, I think, to take into account, which is very different, I think, from what other presidents have been able to do in terms of the communication, right, out there. He's been very effective in communication his fight against corruption, corrupt authoritarian past, even if nothing has actually changed in terms of actual policies that have been enacted on the matter. I think that is a first element to take into account. A second element is that there has been a deep work that, again, maybe from the narrative perspective and some other that has actually been done in terms of social policy on the issue of inequality, which there are deep grievances in that regard in Mexico. And indeed, that has been a problem. A question, however, is whether the kinds of policies that López Obrador has envisioned were really the way to go to tackle inequality and to lead to more polarization, right, between different groups in the country. So I think that he has been able to tap on two big issues among the Mexican electorate: corruption and inequality, and being able to speak to them and build a narrative around it in a way that I think no other have been able to do. His narrative and his decision to bring down what he has called economic privilege among public servants, for example, to reduce the space for corrupt arrangements, to create a truly devoted and committed public servants. I think that's something that resonates, again, in a very unequal society that has been affected by these issues. So I think that that's something to take into account, that he has been on a campaign for 2 decades almost, and I think that's also to take another element to take into account, which I don't think that even Claudia Sheinbaum, right, from his same party, is able to have the same charisma and approach and narrative. So it's not the case that we're going to see the same thing with the upcoming president. I think that López Obrador has been able to work this out for a long time.
Yeah, well, good point. Now let me focus on that issue. Andrés Manuel López Obrador can't run for office again, so there is an election. In the process, we have 3 candidates, 2 are women, And I would like to ask you if it probably will be the first time in history that Mexico will have a woman as a president, if this is to somehow related with the feminist agenda, or how do you understand this issue?
I would say I have mixed feelings about this question. I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that if a comparativist from Mars will look at Mexico in planet Earth, like we have had great advances in gender parity, in legislative races, municipal races, gubernatorial races, and whatnot. In the last 10 to 15 years, we have had record numbers of women in government, women in legislative offices, and whatnot. And certainly that should help, that it's a natural extension to have a female president. However, there's also a little bit of an accidental feature to this. I would put it this way, because López Obrador, he's a strong man. He was able to choose his candidate, his preferred candidate. So Obrador chose Claudia Sheinbaum because she's the person that he trusts more. So some of the key figures in his government have been women, like the people that it looks like he trusts women somewhat. So he chooses Claudia Sheinbaum, he appoints her, and then the opposition, in response to Claudia Sheinbaum, chooses strategically to propose a female candidate. And that's why now the two front runners are women. So I would say it's a lucky accident. I think that whoever wins the election is going to be good for the role model of having a woman president. It should help women politicians in the future in other offices. We have been seeing this in the nexus between municipal races and gubernatorial races. Like the more municipal presidents you have being women, it's easier for them to win governorships. So having a woman in the presidency should help. I don't know if it will end corruption and inequality and whatnot, but at least in the gender parity dimension, I think it's good news for the country.
The election of a woman to the Mexican president is, without a doubt, good news in terms of what it means for the opportunities, as Javier was saying, that have opened for women throughout Mexican political history, and thus to women to be able to become presidential candidates. However, this is far from implying that the feminist cause has won in Mexico, right? First, Mexico continues to be among the most violent for women, with over 70% of them having experienced a form of violence over the course of their lifetime, as reported by the Mexican Census Authority, INEGI. And moreover, femicides have been on the rise in the country, partly fueled by growing criminal violence, which we have discussed before. And second, the election of a woman does not guarantee the advancement of the feminist cause. Claudia has had a complex relationship with the feminist movement in Mexico City. Both Claudia and Xochitl have not embraced, for example, the right to abortion, right? That's not been an open discussion in the current campaign. Their language in the last two presidential debates has been far from feminist, pointing at each other's flaws in terms of their features that are not ladylike, right? Such as calling it the iron women, right? So, of course, I applaud that we can finally talk about having a female president, but at the same time, there are so many things that are far away in terms of advancing the feminist cause. And hopefully there's something that either candidate will eventually do if elected.
Javier, to what extent the elections in the U.S. will condition the governance in Mexico in the near future?
Oh, well, I think that the U.S. election is also, we have a lot of internal threats, and the U.S. election is an external threat, because we know that the possibility of Donald Trump winning the presidency again, it may be bad news for Mexico, in the sense that he may use anti-immigration policies, economic sanctions to Mexican exports and whatnot. And on the first Donald Trump term, we had the American populist facing the Mexican populist. And surprising to me, it wasn't so bad. They were able to strike deals. As far as the next Mexican president, I don't know, because we don't know, for instance, if Claudia wins or Xochitl wins, we don't know how strong they're going to be on the legislative end. So I see Mexico, of course, is the fragile country, the small open economy facing the biggest economic partner. Obrador made all kinds of concessions to Donald Trump. But from the inside Mexican borders, the narrative was that he was a successful negotiator versus Trump. Specialists will tell you otherwise. Well, I don't know. Obrador gave every single concession he could to Donald Trump. We'll see. Because the threat was, to dismantle NAFTA, the North American trade agreement. So I think if Donald Trump wins the presidency again, all these discussions will come back. And the problems, the migration problems at the border, part of the security problems in Mexico also have to do with the flows of migrants in the south border and the north border. So certainly it is something to worry about a lot.
So I think something to take into consideration is every 12 years, right? We have this dilemma. We have elections in Mexico, we have elections in the US, and everybody, right, is worried and is shaking about what could happen. And I think particularly this election, I think that what has been missing so far precisely among the two main candidates, Xochitl and Claudia, is their position in terms of the bilateral relationship. I would expect some degree of continuity with Claudia in terms of what will happen with the U.S. The point at which perhaps the Mexican government will be willing to keep moving forward is in terms of weapons, or the traffic of weapons, which the Mexican government has been very upfront about following up, right, on the control of arms in the U.S. And I think that in any case, we are concerned about what Trump will mean for a different kind of relationship between Xochitl or Claudia, right? And I think on Morena's side, we would expect some degree of continuity, and in the side of Xochitl, perhaps there's some kind of resonance that there could be in terms of the two business people perhaps coming together as they have been trying to portray themselves. But the truth is that the Morena candidate is more likely to win. And I don't think that we're going to see a major change in terms of how that bilateral relationship has taken place. And unfortunately, there could be much more that could be done in terms of intelligence and data sharing, right, between the two nations. And I don't think that's something that we will see in the short run, given the kind of relationship that Morena has had over the past 5 years.
I have a last question for both of you. You have described some, let's say, positive outcomes in terms of the institutionalization of democracy during the transition, but in general what you offer is a quite negative picture in which criminal violence is increasing, electoral democracy is also challenged at the local level, and inequalities are, as usual, a very important issue in the country. In this quite negative context, do you feel that this is a crucial election? There is something fundamental that could change the path in one way or the other in the process we will face in June?
I think it certainly is. I think it's a crucial election. There's a lot of this at stake. I'm not sure about the general electorate seeing it that way. Among the experts and political analysts, they see it that way because, of course, we are still a democracy, but democracy is at risk because we have a poster case of democratic backsliding. You know, the executive attacking the judiciary, the executive trying to push constitutional reforms to weaken democratic checks and balances. A president criticizing civil society, the press, and he's popular and he's charismatic and he has majority in both chambers. Like he's only a few points, 3 or 4 percentage points in the chamber to be able to amend the Constitution. And that's at stake. So for me, if the next president has a qualified majority in Congress, that will be the greatest danger. On the other hand, if Mexican society, if the Mexican electorate choose maybe the continuation of Morena in all likelihood, but with divided government without a majority in any of the chambers or without key gubernatorial races, well, that will force Claudia Sheinbaum or the next president to negotiate with the opposition, because Obrador, that's another distinction. He ran for 6 years, not willing or not being able to negotiate anything with the opposition. And that's why I was looking at the dangers of the executive figure in Mexico, that we thought it was a feature of the past, but no, it's here with electoral democratic legitimacy. So I think, there are big things at stake, but at least it's in the hands of the Mexican citizens.
So to somehow, for you, the point is more who gets, if the winner gets or not a majority in the parliament is more important than who wins. Sandra, what do you think? How do you assess the point?
Perhaps something that we haven't said very explicitly in this conversation is that this is the largest election in Mexican history. You have over 20,000 positions that are up for election, right? So I agree with Javier that we're worried about what happens with Congress, right, with the legislative branch. But I think there's also so much at stake at the subnational level, right? With governors and mayors, and what it means for the upcoming president, with who she will be able to work or not, given the deep polarization process that we have gone through over the past years, more so, as I have said, in this administration. And again, I would say, in addition to more criminal violence that has been present, so just to give you a sense, in 2018, which was already back then the largest election we had, there were 71 attacks by organized crime against candidates. In 2021, we had 84 attacks. In 2024, we already had 50 attacks. So we're already over, right, half of what we have seen in the previous elections. There's more coming up probably in this election. So there's more at stake in terms of how these new elected authorities, how vulnerable they're going to be once elected, given how present organized crime has been, and then given the level of polarization that we have, and to what extent they'll be able to work with the incoming administration. So it is also important for Morena to know how many of these subnational positions they're going to get. And so what that means for other constitutional reforms for which they will require also their support. So I agree with Javier that this is about how the legislative is going to look like, but also how the distribution across the territory will look like, because of what that means to expand the agenda of the fourth transformation, as they call themselves, right? And the new reforms are on their way to further weaken crucial checks and balances.
Well, with this very worrying picture of what is going on in Mexico, we arrive to the end of this episode of Who is Voting in 2024. Sandra and Javier, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. It was a pleasure.